Hello, welcome to The Rest is History. For fans of the England football team, Tom, the subject of today's podcast is something of a sore point because 4 years ago, when the World Cup was held in Russia, England went on a remarkable run to reach the semi-finals, but were knocked out by the eventual runners-up, Croatia. And Croatia is a wonderful country, fascinating history. Tom, you've chosen a subject from Croatian history to focus on today. And who or what are you talking about?
Croatian-ish. Because
Croatian-ish.
The focus is a period long before the creation of the modern state of Croatia.
Okay.
And the focus is a man he was born Diocles in the 3rd century AD, early 240s AD, at a place called Salona. And today, if you've been to the city of Split, Solin it's still there. It's a suburb of Split now. But back in the 3rd century AD, it belonged to a region called Dalmatia, which in turn was part of a region of the empire called Illyricum.
So, Tom, just to jump in for 1 second. So those people who don't know much about Croatian history, but maybe have been to Croatia, if they've been through Split, they will have seen, won't they, one of the most extraordinary Roman buildings still standing, which is Diocletian's Palace, which is basically the city centre of Split.
Yes, it is. And you may be wondering, what's the link between this chap Diocles and Diocletian? Well, all will be revealed in due course, because Diocles is a figure from a very, very obscure background. He's the son of a scribe who may have been a freedman or may actually have been a slave. So Diocles may conceivably have been born unfree. So he comes absolutely from the bottom of the pile. And yet, amazingly, Diocles will become Diocletian. I'm giving away the twist. That's the twist. He rules as emperor for over 20 years, from 284 to 305. So how is it possible that someone from the bottom of the social order could have risen to become not just emperor, but, ruling for 2 decades? And the answer to that lies in the circumstances into which he is born, which is one of utter convulsion and chaos for the Roman Empire. It's basically a kind of 50-year period of anarchy that almost sees the Roman order implode completely. And it's in conditions of chaos that people from outside the social elites can rise to the top.
And this is what people call the crisis of the 3rd century, isn't it?
Crisis doesn't really do it justice.
Right.
So essentially, it sees the entire order of the Roman Empire as it had been set up by Augustus, and which had prevailed for essentially 2 centuries. It sees it pretty much on its uppers. So the essence of the Augustan settlement, the imperial order that he creates out of the collapse of the Republic, which had been the previous kind of great process of convulsion and near collapse that the Roman order had gone through, is that it's an autocracy. You have rule by one man, an imperator comes, the emperor, but that it is done in association with the Senate. And Augustus pretends that he is less powerful than he actually is, and the Senate has the illusion that it is more powerful than it really is. And so senators, they rise up through a kind of chain of military and civilian commands, and they're providing the emperor with the elites that enable the empire to be administered. And this had served the Roman order very well for about 2 centuries. But then in the 3rd century, it all goes to pot. And it's a vast kind of conflux of circumstances that we don't really have time to focus in on too. And I think that we should do maybe a series of episodes on this process, because it's very, very, very interesting and maybe mildly topical when we look at the state of Britain and Europe at the moment.
Oh no, Tom, don't say that.
But if we want to cheer ourselves up now, things were far, far worse in the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. So what you have huge pressure on the frontiers. So you have the barbarians along the Rhine and the Danube, which had always been there, but they're kind of tribal entities that are conglomerating. So they're able to execute more and more pressure. Yeah. But the real problem is that in the East, the Parthian Empire, which had been a rather ramshackle entity, has collapsed and been replaced by a much more aggressive and efficient imperial order under a Persian dynasty called the Sassanids, so the Sasanian Empire. Yeah. And that is a superpower fit to rival Rome. So for the first time, it's up against a kind of equal power. And that generates huge pressure. At the same time, within the fabric of the empire itself, you have a succession of civil wars people grasping after the imperial purple being dispatched. So, at various points, you have maybe 3, 4, 5 people in very, very rapid succession in charge. So you have civil war, you have external war. The consequent effect of this is the collapse of the tax base. You see fields, particularly along the frontiers, turning to weeds. Cities are left as charred and pillaged piles of rubble. So these are regions that are no longer paying taxes. As a result, the emperors need to impose ever higher taxes on those who can pay. That in turn generates economic collapse. Economic collapse in turn generates famine. On top of that, you get cycles of plague starting to sweep in. Remember, we had an episode with Karl Harper on this. Yeah. Absolutely kind of horrendous process. So it's a terrible state of affairs. And essentially, in this process of anarchy, the one key institution, the only institution that is capable of maintaining some kind of order, it's not the Senate, it's the army.
Right. Because these emperors who are rising and falling, are these generally rival commanders, basically, being elevated by their troops?
Yes, by and large. And to begin with, they're from the senatorial class. But increasingly, with all the pressure that you're getting on the frontiers, the absolute kind of requirement for efficient military leadership, having some kind of amateur guy come in for a couple of years is inadequate. You need a professional officer class.
Right.
And so what happens over the course of the 3rd century is that you get this kind of elite army corps, protectores they are called, who start to replace the senators as people in charge of the legions and the auxiliary forces. And most of these tend to come from the Balkans. They're called Illyriki, so people from Illyricum. And that's because these are tough, brutal guys who are not produced from the flesh pots of Italy. They are raised to fight. Yeah. And they are essentially the most effective military operators in the empire. Senators hate them, of course, but more and more they are coming to run the army. And this is the background into which Diocles, who is, he is from Illyricum, this is what he's born into. And Gibbon, who, his account of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire is the great narrative account of this process, says of Diocles that his abilities were useful rather than splendid. And I guess that sums up the whole kind of warrior caste from Illyricum. Right. They are useful, they're not splendid. They do not have a background in Virgil. They are not able to construe Greek poetry. They do not have a knowledge of philosophy. But their abilities are very, very useful in a time of invasion and civil war.
They're kind of hard-headed, military, ruthless fixers.
Yes, and in a way, the paradox is that Diocles, he has no real education beyond that his father, as a scribe, can give him. So he's literate, but he doesn't have the kind of the equivalent of a doctorate from Oxford or being to Stanford, that kind of level. He doesn't have that. But what he does have is a sense of himself as Roman in the traditional sense, the traditional hard, tough, kind of early Republican sense, the turnip-eating peasant who goes out and defeats the Samnites or the Carthaginians, that kind of thing. He's aware of that, and he's a very pious person. He feels that the dues have to be paid to the traditional gods, and that perhaps the traditional dues haven't been paid, and this is why the gods are punishing the Roman people. So although he would be despised by a senator as a barbarian, he sees himself as a deeply, deeply Roman figure. And so he's very proud to serve in the Roman army. He's very good at it. He rises to the command of a squadron of troops on the Danube. And meanwhile, as he is rising up through the ranks of the army, what you are seeing is people from Illyricum not just rising to the command of legions, but becoming emperors. And they prove themselves to be excellent emperors.
So what sort of names are we talking about, Tom?
So there's a guy called Claudius, who not the Claudius who conquers Britain, but the Claudius who people who listen to our episode on St. Valentine's Day may remember that we talked about. There's a Claudius who supposedly executed a Valentine. This is the Claudius, but he's a very effective leader. He defeats an enormous Gothic invasion over the Danube. You have a guy called Aurelian, who at a time when the empire is falling apart at the seams, you've got people declaring independence in Gaul, in the East, all over the place. He stitches it all back together very, very effectively. He's also the guy who builds the walls around Rome itself. which is a real kind of measure of the time, that even the eternal city needs protection. And then you have a guy called Probus, who
Right.
who, as his name implies, is he goes in hard, he goes in deep. And
thanks for that, Tom.
and he rules for about 6 years, and he's very, very militarily successful. And he pushes back again anyone who dares to kind of cross the Rhine, the Danube, the frontier with Persia. And in fact, at the end of his life, he's preparing the invasion of Mesopotamia, which is very traditional Roman behavior.
Carrying the fight to the enemy. And also he feels able to kind of reinstate a form of the traditional constitutional order, the traditional relationship between the emperor and the Senate. So he's kind of feeling that he's able to inch his way back to restoring that traditional relationship. Yeah. And that may be why when he dies, inevitably in a mutiny, this is happening all the time, the guy who follows him, a guy called Carus, I mean, he's the kind of figure who you might recognize from the 2nd century. He's born in Gaul. He's been raised in Rome. He's a senator. His rise through the ranks, it's not just been military. He's also held civic offices. And in a way, as it will turn out, he's almost the last of a kind. So he perhaps is the last of these traditional civilian Augustan figures who rises to become emperor. But he's only in power for about 9 months. He rushes out. He takes control of the invasion that Probus had been preparing of Mesopotamia, a bit like Alexander taking over after Philip is murdered. And he launches an invasion of Mesopotamia. All goes tremendously well. He captures Ctesiphon, the capital of the Sassanid Empire. The Sassanid king is very distracted by civil wars himself. Diocles goes as commander of his cavalry. The commander of the Praetorians, a man called Arrius Aper, is also there. All seems to be going splendidly. And then Carus dies in the summer of 283, so 9 months after he became emperor. And the story is that he got struck by lightning. Gets incinerated by a lightning bolt. That's incredible bad luck, Tom.
It is. And it's such incredible bad luck that inevitably people have wondered whether it really was credible. But let's say it did happen. So Carus has 2 sons. One is a guy called Carinus, who's back in Rome. And the other is a guy called Numerian, very Tolkien-esque name, I think. Yeah. Who is there with him and with the legions.
Oh, I know what happens to Numerian. But go on, tell the story. I love this story.
Numerian is proclaimed kind of co-emperor with his brother Carinus back in Rome. And they decide to withdraw because Numerian wants to go back and make sure that he's not going to be stabbed in the back by his brother. They're marching back, very slow process back. Numerian ends up being confined to his litter. And Arrius Aper, the Praetorian prefect, says that this is because he's got bad eyes. He can't wear shades. The sun is very bright in his eyes, so he has to...
Well, the desert would be bad for you. It would be bad for your eyes, Tom.
He has to lie in his litter with, kind of wet flannel over his eyes. And they go on, back and back. And various soldiers who approach the litter start to report an unpleasant smell coming from the litter.
And, what could it be?
And Arrius Aper says it's absolutely nothing. He's the emperor is very well. He's got some personal hygiene problems, but which of us hasn't? And this is where Gibbon, ever skeptical, says, could no aromatics be found in the imperial household? And sure enough, they've reached the Bosphorus, Nicomedia, city south of what will become Constantinople, on the south side. And they peek behind the curtain, and there is Numerian looking very, very dead indeed.
Presumably bright green by this point.
Yes. Yeah, he's really not looking good. And there are 2 things to be decided. The first is who is responsible for the death of Numerian. Did he die of natural causes or was he murdered? And the second is who's going to replace him. And there are really 2 candidates. One is Arrius Aper, the Praetorian prefect, and the other is Diocles, the commander of the horse. And they all head off to a kind of a military council at Chalcedon, which is just up the coast from Nicomedia. And it's Aper against Diocles, who's going to become emperor. And it's Diocles who wins. And Diocles wins by saying that Aper has murdered Numerian.
Well, it's a reasonable
supposition.
But
I think, but the the paucity of our sources and the fact that Diocles wins and is then emperor for 2 decades means it's perfectly possible that perhaps he did. I mean, we don't know.
Yes, of course.
But basically what happens then is that, so this is late November 284. Diocles goes back to a hill outside Nicomedia, and he adopts the splendid name of Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus. So Diocletian on this hill. He then has Appa dragged out in chains to stand behind him, tells the assembled legions that Appa is the man who killed Numerian. He draws out his sword, stabs Appa, runs him through, and he is now emperor in the East. However, there's a problem, because listeners may remember that the unfortunate Numerian had a brother.
That's right, Carinus,
who is still back in Rome. Now, the reports on Carinus make him sound an absolute rotter.
What's he doing?
Up there with Caligula and Nero. Well, so he apparently he has a succession of wives, and he gets each one pregnant, and then he's so revolted by the fact that he's got them pregnant that he dumps them and moves on to another one. And this is just a typical example of his disgraceful behaviour.
That's the kind of behaviour you see on the Mail Online sidebar of shame every day, though, Tom.
Yes, so he is put in the sidebar of shame by Diocletian's propagandists. But in fact, he seems to have been pretty effective, pretty efficient, and he collects together an army. He marches out from Rome. He marches into the Balkans. He meets with Diocletian at a place called Margus, very near where Belgrade is today, and he's on the verge of winning the battle when he too gets assassinated.
Oh,
and again,
chances. You
may wonder, well, people who come up against Diocletian, they all seem to come to grisly ends. So he's assassinated just at the moment of victory, and Diocletian becomes emperor, and he's the sole emperor.
So Diocletian at this stage is how old, roughly?
About 40.
And do we know anything about him in those first 40 years, other than the rise up the ranks?
Not really, no. Apart from the fact that he is from this very humble background, that he has no real cultural hinterland, but he is a very patriotic Roman. He's a very devout, in the kind of the sense of the ancient traditions of the Roman city. He despises, oddly, paradoxically, the city of Rome itself. So he does not go to Rome to have his powers ratified by the Senate. And clearly the reason for this is that he's rubbing the noses of the Senate in the fact that they're obsolete. And over the course of his rule, what he will do is essentially terminate the entire Augustan settlement. And his rule will probably be the most decisive, the most influential since the time of Augustus, because it will end up putting the Roman Empire on entirely new foundations. Ooh. And I think we should take a break at this point.
That's a great cliffhanger, Tom. Very exciting. An institutional cliffhanger. We don't get enough of those.
When we come back, we'll have a look at how he did it.
Great. See you in a minute. Welcome back to The Rest is History. We are talking about the history of Croatia. Well, Croatia-ish, according to Tom Holland. So we're talking about probably, you could argue, the most famous, the most influential, the most important historical character to have ever come from the lands that we now know as Croatia, and that is the Roman Emperor Diocletian. So, Tom, he's just become emperor.
Yeah.
There's been lightning bolts, there's been people turning green in letters, all kinds of stuff.
To carry on.
Yeah. But now Diocletian is the man. He hates Rome, but he likes Romanitas, I suppose, it's fair to say.
Yeah, wonderfully put.
And he wants to make Rome great again, but he's not just a traditionalist, he's a modernizer as well. Is that right? He's a kind of cultural traditionalist, but an institutional modernizer?
Nobody in Rome would characterize themselves as modernizers. Right. You introduce radical reforms by saying that you're going back to the past.
Yeah.
And what Diocletian is doing is he's trying to get Rome back to its rugged military self that he sees as having been lost. But initially, his job is the job that's been confronting Roman emperors for at least 50 years, which is basically to try and stabilize what is absolute chaos. So there are barbarians crashing across the Danube. So that's what Diocletian in person, he goes to sort that off. There's also huge crisis in Gaul. There are barbarians that cross the Rhine, but there are also basically it's the Gilets jaunes are making their first appearance in northern Gaul. They're called the Bagaudai. They're objecting to the enormous amounts of tax that are being imposed on them. they are kind of coming out with their tractors and their yellow jackets and dumping manure in the streets of Lutetia and all that kind of stuff. So they need to be sorted out.
Yeah.
And the other very 21st century Europe thing that's happened is that a guy called Croatia has launched Brexit.
Of course he has, yes.
So he's a kind of, he's the commander of the Saxon shore forts. So he's commander of the kind of the Channel Fleet. And he has declared a kind of unilateral independence, although it's not actually a full Brexit because he sees himself as Roman as well. And he basically sees himself as an equal of Diocletian. So all of this has to be sorted out.
Yeah.
The barbarians need to be pushed back. The Bagaudae need to be crushed. And Britannia needs to be brought back into the fabric of the Roman Empire. And Diocletian sets about doing this very effectively in a rather novel way. So he himself campaigns in the Balkans, does it very effectively, flings them back into the wilds beyond the Danube. But he takes on a partner. So he adopts a guy called Maximian as his son and gives him the title of Caesar. Diocletian's own title is Augustus. He gives Maximian the title of Caesar.
So is this the first time that happened, Tom?
This is the first time that it's institutionalized. So essentially, Maximian is his partner. He is equal, and this is quite a novelty because essentially what Diocletian is saying is that he is unable to cope, or anyone is unable to cope with the rule of the entire empire. He needs an autonomous fellow emperor covering the West. He basically takes responsibility for the East, and so he appoints this guy Maximian to the rule of the West. And Maximian, like Diocles, is an Illyrian peasant. He's a seasoned general. He's got the kind of classic square head of the 3rd century.
Is that what people have? Balkan square heads?
Judging by the sculpture, there's a very kind of cubist trend in Roman sculpture at this point. They all have these kind of terrifying square heads and short hair, like the kind of minders that Djokovic had when he went to when he refuses to take vaccines.
The men you would expect to see outside guarding the entrance to a nightclub. Turbo folk drifting down the street.
Yes.
A massive German BMW outside.
That kind of thing. Absolutely that kind of thing. And Maximian is a very, very effective general. He lacks Diocletian's cunning and ability to see the kind of statesmanship that Diocletian comes to show. But he's an effective operator. He goes off to Gaul. He crushes the Bagaudae. He, as Diocletian had done, pushes the barbarians back, in his case, back beyond the Rhine. And he then has to deal with Croatia, but he can't do that because he can't raise a fleet. Oh. So it's a bit like Napoleon trying to raise a fleet. To seize control of the Channel. He lacks control of the shipping lanes, and so he can't get his forces over to Britain. So Croatia is kind of thumbing his nose at Maximian and, of course, Diocletian. And so this brings home to Diocletian that maybe even more wholesale reform is needed. So in 286, he promotes Maximian to Augustus. So there are now 2 Augusti.
Right.
And this is kind of key innovation.
2 emperors.
However, at the same time, it's also not an innovation because, of course, the idea that power should be divided between 2 people is actually a primordial Roman idea going back to the consulship, because classically the Romans had 2 consuls. And so this is kind of classic Diocletian maneuver. On the one hand, it's a radical innovation that there can be 2 Augusti. On the other, it's kind of back to the future. You're going back to the primordial origins of the Roman Republic and the entire Roman state. As
people remember from our podcasts about Caesar crossing the Rubicon, or indeed the downfall of Cleopatra, the idea of dividing power between 2 or more people.
Yes.
It's part of the great stories of Roman history, isn't it? The division between Antony and Octavian or something.
But they have both have the title of Augustus. But of course, it's a repudiation of the autocracy that the original Augustus had himself introduced. So there are all kinds of paradoxes lurking around there. And Diocletian proclaims himself to be the son of Jupiter. So he takes on the title of Jovius. Jove is alternative name for Jupiter.
Right.
And Maximian is cast as the son of Heracles, so he takes on the name of Herculius. So these are peasants who are now basically divine. They're semi-divine.
Tom, can I just ask about their names? So Maximian had been Caesar, and then he's promoted to Augustus. So obviously there's a sense at this point that Caesar, which was originally a name, has become a title.
Yeah.
But is there is it Diocletian who dreams up the fact that Caesar will be junior to Augustus, or was there already a sense that Augustus was a superior title to Caesar?
Well, so Caesar, as you say, is a family name that becomes one that is adopted by everyone who becomes emperor.
Yeah.
So it's a name that ultimately derives from the Roman aristocracy. But Augustus is a title that conveys an almost supernatural quality.
Yeah.
You're midway between the earthly and the divine, midway between the mortal and the human. So to be an Augustus is better than being a Caesar.
Do you not think that all British prime ministers should become a Walpole?
Yeah, it would be quite good, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some, I think it's fair to say, Tom, would do greater justice to the name than others.
Yes. I mean, what the equivalent of Augustus would be, I don't know. Kind of God or something.
God. Yeah.
So if you do very well, you become God. Otherwise, you're Walpole. Yeah, I mean, that kind of idea. Right. And in fact, in 292, Diocletian makes the system even more complicated because he and Maximian both adopt very successful, very able deputies who then take on the name of Caesar, and they're all emperors now. So you now have 4 emperors. So you have a tetrarchy, 4 rulers in Greek.
So this has always fascinated me, Tom. I love the tetrarchy. I think it's just so strange. So first of all, it comes at the end of a period in which basically emperors have been rising and falling about every 2 weeks or something, like British prime ministers in the present day.
Yeah.
And it's extraordinary self-confidence on Diocletian's part to share his power with what people that a lesser man might have seen as military rivals, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's a reflection both on Diocletian's self-confidence, but also his cunning and his ability to choose the right people. So that's the key.
Yeah, he chooses people he completely trusts.
But it's not just trust; it's also people who lack the ability to rival him. So Maximian is he's a kind of solid deputy.
Yeah,
he's the kind of guy that a mafia boss would want at his back. But he's not smart enough. He's not imaginative enough to rule the whole empire.
And do the 4 tetrarchs, do they ever hold kind of board meetings all together where they discuss policy?
They do. So in March 293, Maximian meets with the guy who he adopts as his son, so Caesar, a guy called Constantius.
Right.
Meanwhile, in Sirmium, which is now in Serbia, Diocletian is adopting a guy called Galerius. So the Western Augustus and the Western Caesar and the Western and the Eastern Augustus and the Eastern Caesar are meeting up. The empire is kind of roughly divided up. So Constantius gets the territory beyond the Alps, so Gaul, and the responsibility for finishing off Carausius. Maximian gets Italy and Africa.
Yeah.
Galerius gets Greece and the Balkans, and Diocletian gets the rest.
Right. Yeah.
So Diocletian keeps for himself the richest provinces, basically.
So that's not utterly dissimilar from the divisions that you'd seen in previous periods in Roman history, the basic east-west kind of division, I suppose.
It's following the fracture lines of geography. Yeah. So the Alps is an obvious division line. The Adriatic is an obvious dividing line. Yes, and these are the fracture lines that again and again over the course of Roman history keep kind of splitting apart.
You always want the East because the East is the richest cities, the most urbanized, all of that stuff.
Yeah, but in a way that the sense that they're getting, the equivalent of provinces is not entirely. I mean, it's kind of true, but it's not entirely true because they are all equally emperors.
Right.
So there's a geographical specificity, but there's also a sense that if one of them goes to another part of the empire, they're still equally emperor.
Yeah.
And all of them are very, very successful. So all of them, like Diocletian, are Illyrian peasants, rustic, uncultured, but great. They prove to be great servants of the empire. They're seasoned by hardship. They're seasoned by war. They do what has to be done.
Tom, I never would have guessed that you would have such a fondness for kind of Balkan warlords.
I'm not fond of them. They're terrifying figures.
Yeah.
I mean, they're brutal, terrifying figures, and you would not want to run up against them. But when you're in a condition where the alternative is complete collapse and anarchy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the age-old decision. What's worse, anarchy or brutal order?
You know my views, Tom.
I do know your views. And I think that, I would, if I was a barbarian, I wouldn't be in favor of them. But probably if I was a guy, trying to run a business in Gaul, I'd be very keen.
You're on your own double glazing company, and you
need a firm government.
Yeah, you need the smack of firm government.
So it all goes very well. Constantius ends up retaking Britain. So there's a famous medallion in the British Museum, the only illustration from the Roman period of London, where he's shown riding in on a horse, being greeted by cheering by the kneeling figure of Londinium. There's a rebellion in Egypt, which Diocletian suppresses.
Yeah.
And best of all, and the real marker that Rome is back, there's a brilliant war against the Persians.
I love a brilliant war.
Fabulously well. And in fact, it goes so well that Diocletian and Galerius, who have teamed up for this, actually managed to capture the Persian royal family. So again, like Alexander captures the Persian royal family. Diocletian does the same, and the Persian king is so desperate to get them back that he agrees to pretty humiliating terms. So this is a treaty signed at a place called Nisibis on the Roman Persian frontier in 299, and it sees the Roman frontier massively strengthened. So this has been a source of weakness and instability for decades and decades and decades for Rome, and now it's massively strengthened. And this is probably the single most important contribution that Diocletian makes to the stability of the Roman Empire. Is to shore up the east. He shores up the east, and that then gives him the breathing space to turn to the kind of reforms that no emperor has had for 60 years. The functioning of the economy, the functioning of the administration, all that kind of thing. So Diocletian's reforms are incredibly significant, and they basically provide the foundations for what will become the Byzantine Empire. So they will survive the collapse of the Roman Empire in the East, and they will provide the underpinnings for Roman provincial administration up until the coming of the Arabs in the 7th century. So these are very, very momentous. Obviously, his focus, as it's been for every emperor, is the army. So he increases forces, he improves fortifications. So a lot of the most impressive Roman fortifications that survive are from this period. They're expressive of a kind of revolutionary approach to how you defend places. And he is able to pay for this because he has simultaneously introduced a bureaucracy that is closer to that of China than the traditional Roman kind of decentralized form, where you have people from senatorial backgrounds kind of rising up and employing freedmen or equestrians or whatever. This is a kind of a bureaucracy that obeys a kind of chain of command, pretty much like the army.
I was about to say it's a much more militarized state under Diocletian, isn't it?
It is. So basically, the whole of the Roman Empire exists to raise money, to pay troops, to defend it, so that money can be raised to pay the troops.
Right.
So it's a military fiscal complex is perhaps the best way to put it.
It's a sort of self-perpetuating tax-raising machine.
Yes. And so from this point on, Roman emperors and their servants, they have a much heavier tread than emperors in previous generations had.
Right.
And he is a very efficient administrator. He restructures the Augustan provincial system entirely. So he divides the provinces up into much smaller units. Do you know the name of the people who are put in charge of these kind of much smaller units?
It'll
be very popular with a lot of the more clerical wangs that we have.
Right. Are they called deacons?
No, they're called vicars.
Vicars.
So Diocletian, in the hour of the empire's need, trusts the administration to vicars.
To an army of vicars.
An army of vicars. But there are also larger units, which are called dioceses.
Ah. Yeah.
And Italy loses its privileges, so it becomes a kind of region much like anywhere else. So it now starts to be taxed for the first time.
Quick question about Diocletian. Where does he spend most of his time?
He spends most of his time in Nicomedia.
So that's Iznik in Turkey. Yeah.
Yes. But he's peripatetic. He kind of roams across the Balkans and across the East. He is very, very keen on people showing him the kind of respect that people show the Persian emperors respect. So he introduces this custom of proskynesis that had been a cause of outrage to Romans and to Greeks for centuries and centuries.
Alexander the Great had terrible trouble with this.
Yes. So this is prostration. This is people coming into the presence of the emperor, have to bow. They have to prostrate themselves. And this is very, very not what Augustus had done. The whole thing about Augustus was that he was pretending to be a senator like anyone else. This is the absolute opposite. Diocletian is insisting that people who come into the presence of an Augustus or a Caesar show the respect that is due to him as the head of the Roman state.
Does that, plus the bureaucracy, suggest that the Roman Empire is, for want of a better word, and I know this isn't the ideal word, being orientalized? Is it becoming more Persianized? Because you mentioned China, say a Chinese-style bureaucracy. Are the Romans getting a lot of these ideas from Persia and perhaps beyond that, though they might not know it, from powers further east?
I mean, I think that the custom of proskynesis does come from Persia. So to that extent, perhaps you could say yes. But I think that the fact that Diocletian ends up constructing a bureaucracy that does parallel that in China is simply a reflection of the fact that there are only certain ways that you can order an emperor, a large empire.
Yeah.
Reflects the fact that there are only certain ways you can structure an empire in a pre-industrial age. And that, Rome had begun as a city and a republic. And in the face of the crisis that it faces in the 3rd century, those ancient traditions are inadequate to cope with the scale of what is required. And that is why you have this heavy tread and this obsession that Diocletian shows with basically trying to impose order on everything. And he can only impose order if he has the military and the bureaucracy. He can say, do this, and they go off and do it in a way that simply hadn't existed before. And the measure of how keen he is to do this is that he starts to try and impose order wherever he sees chaos. So notoriously, one of the ways he does this, he's desperate to stop inflation, which is completely out of control. So he tries to stabilize the currency. He introduces gold and silver coinage, but inflation still continues to raise. And so notoriously, in 301 he introduces this edict on maximum prices.
Oh yeah,
which is quite. That's quite what it's quite. Harold Wilson.
Right, yes, it is. It's very
Heath.
It's very Ted Heath, Harold Wilson, Heath. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was free from price controls by the early 70s.
So essentially, what Diocletian is doing, he has no understanding of economics. He looks at prices rising. He assumes the only reason for this can be that all the merchants are being greedy. And so he imposes a list. Stop it. This is how much things have to cost, and you're not allowed to go any higher.
Yeah.
And of course, for economic historians, it's fascinating.
People love to write about this period, don't they?
It gives us a complete list of what prices were, what they should be. Really, really interesting. Of course, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. But Diocletian's ambition to stabilize the currency by improving the gold content and the silver content does work. And although
because it's been progressively devalued, hasn't it, the Roman currency?
Although in due course the silver standard will be abandoned, the gold standard will be preserved, and the gold solidus will become the basis for the Byzantine recovery in due course. Right. The other, even more notorious attempt to impose order is an attempt to impose order on the dimension of the supernatural.
Yes, I thought we'd get to this.
So, in the wake of the Treaty of Nisibis, which he signed with the Persians, he is now able to ask the kind of theological question: why have things been going so badly? Now that I've stabilized the eastern frontier, I can start to try and make things up to the gods who have clearly been angered. And he arrives in Antioch, which is, after Rome and Alexandria, the 3rd city in the empire in Syria. And while he's there, a Christian deacon called Romanus, he comes from Caesarea just down the coast, tries to stop sacrifices to the gods. This, for Diocletian, clarifies everything that's been going wrong. There are groups of people that have emerged who are disrespectful of the gods, who don't believe in the gods, who are scorning them. There are people called Manichaeans who are followers of a Persian prophet called Mani. So Diocletian launches a campaign of persecution against them. But Romanus is a Christian. And so it's the Christians that become the main focus of his ambition. So Romanus himself, he has his tongue cut off. He's taken to prison. He's executed. Diocletian and Galerius, and again, you asked, do they meet up? Absolutely, they do. Diocletian and Galerius have a consultation about what they should do about the Christians. Diocletian is happy just to stop Christians from being allowed to hold office. Galerius wants to go much further. He says we should have a campaign of extermination. And Diocletian says, well, we should consult the oracle. So they go to the oracle of Apollo at Didymus. And Apollo says, yeah, go for it.
Right. Oh,
Go for it. Go
who would have
flat
guessed?
out. Yeah. So February 303, Diocletian by this point is back in Nicomedia. There's a church that had just been built there, and he has it razed to the ground. And the following day, he issues an edict against the Christians.
Yeah, very notorious edict. Yeah.
So by the terms of this edict, all the scriptures are destroyed. Every Christian is required to hand over their scriptures. And so the people who do this are called traditores, which means people who hand over. And so for Christians, devout Christians, these traditores are traitors. And that's where we get the word traitor from. It's from this time. So
is that so?
A traditor is originally someone who hands over scriptures.
Tom, that is one of the best facts I've learned in all these episodes of The Rest is History.
It's a top fact.
It's a great fact.
Churches continue to be pulled down,
yeah,
and Christians are banned from assembling to worship. And in the immediate wake of the publication of this edict, there are a series of fires in Nicomedia where sections of Diocletian's palace get burnt down, and Diocletian assumes that this is Christians, and in fact, he regards Nicomedia as being so unsafe that he leaves. So he sees himself basically as a target of kind of terrorism, and so he sees the persecution of Christians as a war on terror. And when Christians are captured, they are executed very horribly. Some of them are kind of roasted over fires, and the memory of this persecution will live very, very long in the memory of the church. I mean, it still does to this day. The Diocletianic persecution is remembered as absolutely the worst. Although I think the motive for it is Galerius. It's Galerius who's really, really even more hostile than Diocletian. But
right.
Diocletian absolutely puts his name to it. However, in the West, Maximian and Constantius, they don't really push it through. So it's really in the East and it's the absolute worst.
Do they not push it through in the West, partly because perhaps there are fewer Christians? It's not such a big deal. It's not so urban. Maybe Christianity hasn't taken off as much as it has in the East. Is that one reason?
Yes, it may be. I think also that they just don't have the kind of ideological animus
right.
that Diocletian seems to have had. And so all of this is by way, it's a radical process of reform. It transforms the Roman Empire utterly and permanently. But Diocletian sees himself as a traditionalist. And so in due course, in November 303, he visits Rome for the first and last time. I mean, it's possible that he visited Rome very fleetingly in the very early months of his reign, but I think it's unlikely,
right?
Because he seems to have viewed this visit to Rome as being a kind of celebration of the fact that he has restored to the Roman people their traditional customs and therefore their traditional greatness, because the two for Diocletian are mutually independent. And so he goes to Rome and he celebrates the 20th anniversary of his rule and a triumph that is the very last pagan triumph to be celebrated in Rome.
Right.
But he hates Rome, and he is appalled by what by what Gibbon calls the licentious familiarity of the Romans.
Oh no! What are they doing to him?
No. So he leaves by the end of the year. It's December. It's cold. He gets a chill, and he just falls increasingly ill. He gets to Nicomedia by November the following year, makes a public appearance, and then collapses. And it's feared that he's going to die.
Yeah,
but he doesn't. But March 305, he reemerges, but he's an absolute shadow of himself. And 2 months later, he goes to the hill where he had been proclaimed emperor, where he'd taken on the name of Diocletianus. And he there, for the first time ever, he abdicates. So he's the first Roman emperor to give up the purple.
Well, that's the most extraordinary detail of the story at all, I think, Tom. That he lays down his command, which is something that not even Augustus or Tiberius, those first emperors, had felt able or had wanted to do.
Tiberius, I think, kind of did want to do it. And I think if it had been an option, he would have done it.
But
so he retires to the cavalry, but he doesn't know. And Tiberius says, well, you can't, you're holding a wolf by its ears. When you're emperor, you're holding a wolf by its ears. And so you can't let go of those ears, because if you do, the wolf will turn and savage you and rip you to pieces.
But Diocletian was confident that he wouldn't be prosecuted. No one would come after him.
He is. And I think that's a reflection in his confidence in the people that he's chosen, and in his hope that just as he's instituted very clear kind of cycles of promotion for the military and for the civil service. So the same thing will happen with the rulers of the Roman world. So Galerius, who had been Caesar to him, becomes Augustus.
And does Maximian retire at the same time?
Yes. So Maximian is required to retire as Diocletian does. He doesn't like it.
Right.
He doesn't want to at all. He thinks it's a ridiculous idea, but he's obliged to. Now, the question is, who will succeed Galerius and Constantius as Caesar now that they've become the Augusti?
They need to choose their own deputies.
And I think that they had assumed that their sons would. So the son of Constantius is a young man called Constantine. And when Diocletian resigns the purple, Constantine is there with him on that hill outside Nicomedia. But Constantine does not become Caesar. It's a guy called Maximinus who becomes Caesar when in succession to Galerius, who in turn has become the Augustus. And it's a guy called Severus in the West. So there's an inherent instability created there because the sons of the two Caesars who've now become the Augusti, what is their role? And Constantine manages to slip away, and he goes off to join his brother Constantius, who is busy pacifying Britannia. And in due course, Constantius will die in York, and Constantine will lay claim directly to his rule.
Yeah.
With momentous consequences that I'm sure we will do an episode on. We'll do episodes on Constantine. However, Diocletian, meanwhile, he retires back to his homeland. So he goes back to Dalmatia, and he goes back to Salona, and he builds he's been building a huge palace there, and it's built like a kind of fortress. He grows his cabbages there. Yeah,
he famously grows cabbages, doesn't he?
And Maximian wants to come back. He's retired to southern Italy. He kind of writes to Diocletian and says, let's get the band back together. Let's get back on tour. And Diocletian says, if you could see my cabbages that I've grown with my own hands, you wouldn't want to do that. And he dies in 312. And I think he's the first emperor for a very, very long time to kind of die in his own bed.
Yeah.
And by this point, it's evident that the tetrarchal system that he set up has failed because civil war has broken out again. And in due course, Constantine will emerge as sole ruler, sole emperor. Yeah. But as I say, he is very much not a failure because the framework that he provides enables the Roman Empire to survive this near-death experience. And in the 4th century, it's a ferociously strong and effective imperial entity, very, very very, very strong. And the palace that he has founded, so the Latin for palace is palatium.
Yeah.
And in due course, palatium gets shrunk to become split. So the derivation of split is the palatium of Diocletian, and it's it's one of the great sites.
Oh, it is
of Roman archaeology.
For people who don't know, if you go to Split, it's right there on the waterfront. It's huge. I mean, the corridor, the halls of the palace are now the streets of this sort of old quarter of Split, and they're lined with shops and restaurants and ice cream parlors and what have you. But you can still see you're absolutely right there in the palace, in the outline of the palace. It's the most amazing building. If you like the Romans, or indeed if you like Balkan ice creams, it's the perfect place to go.
So I think that's a brilliant end for the Croatian Tourist Board, and I hope that they will appreciate that. And as I say, Diocletian, very, very, very significant figure in the history of Rome and indeed in the history of Europe and the Mediterranean world more generally. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'm sure, Dominic, that we will do more on the late Roman Empire.
Oh, it's fascinating, Tom. I love this period.
We must absolutely do Constantine, for instance. But in the meanwhile, I hope you enjoyed that. And we will definitely be back. We'll be back tomorrow. We'll be back the day after. We'll be back the day after that.
We're never going away.
Never going away. We are lingering like the corpse of Numerian in his litter.
That's not how I thought of this podcast, but I'll take it. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. See you next time.
Bye-bye.